Picture a tense, dust-choked street where seven hardened outlaws size up a solitary traveler in a worn poncho. In the blink of an eye, gunmetal flashes, thunder cracks, and those bandits fall before they can even draw, leaving everyone in stunned silence. That's just the first taste of the action-packed showdown waiting for you in this epic frontier tale. Are you curious about how one quiet stranger could send an entire gang reeling? Or how an entire town on the brink of despair found their courage to rise up? Stick around to hear the full story. Every twist and bullet-scorched turn. You won't believe the lengths our heroes go to in order to protect everything they hold dear. Before we dive in, take a moment to subscribe to this channel and become part of our community. We have countless stories that will keep your heart racing and your imagination fueled. Don't miss a beat. Stay with us and let the tale unfold. A blazing sun hung over the arid landscape, setting the dusty horizon aflame in an orange glow. The once thriving mining town of Saddle Creek lay nestled against a backdrop of ragged cliffs, its main street strangely quiet at midday. In an earlier age, people might have been bustling about the dirt roads and wooden boardwalks, but El Zorro Delgado's gang had a way of snuffing out the joy and prosperity wherever they settled. Over the past months, rumors about El Zorro's cruelty spread far and wide. He was said to be a former officer who turned to banditry, slithering into corrupt deals and building an ever-growing army of outlaws who terrorized innocent towns. Although some doubted the tales of his military precision, everyone agreed on one point. El Zorro Delgado was merciless. All day, a simmering tension weighed on the residents of Saddle Creek. Children remained indoors, and those few adults brave enough to venture out hurried along with eyes cast low, afraid to draw attention to themselves. A rickety old sign that read Sheriff's Office flapped mournfully in the wind, as though lamenting its own irrelevance. Behind that creaking sign was Sheriff Ronald Carter, once a famed lawman known for his iron will. But that was years ago, before the bandits murdered his wife and son in cold blood. Since then, Carter had taken to drowning his failures in cheap whiskey, leaving Saddle Creek defenseless against the mounting threats beyond its fragile borders. On this sweltering afternoon, a solitary figure emerged on the far side of town. The man rode a lean, coal-black stallion that trotted with uncanny composure, almost as though it sensed the tension coiled in the air. The stranger's broad-brimmed hat was angled low, casting a shadow across his weathered face. A sun-bleached poncho, tattered at the edges, draped his wiry frame. The garment looked like it had seen countless days under scorching desert skies. Though his appearance should have raised curiosity, the residents had been taught caution by the brutality of the outlaws. No one rushed to greet him. He rode at an unhurried pace, observing the boarded windows and deserted sidewalks. A glimpse at his holster revealed a revolver that sat low on his thigh, a telltale sign of either a reckless gunslinger or a supremely confident one. But there was something about him, perhaps in the steadiness of his posture or the silence he carried with him, that hinted at lethal experience. Tying his horse loosely outside Ana Morales' saloon, the man took the rickety steps two at a time, his spurs ringing an unhurried tune. Inside, a handful of patrons caught sight of him and paused mid-conversation. A hush descended. Ana Morales, the saloon's proprietor, watched from behind the bar with cautious fascination. She was a stocky woman in her early 40s, her jet-black hair pulled into a low bun. She had survived enough trouble in Saddle Creek to recognize danger in a person's stance. Her close friend and assistant, Carolina Reyes, frowned warily at the newcomer from where she served a pair of nervous ranch hands. Derbasu, the local physician who kept a small clinic next to the abandoned telegraph office, played solitaire at a corner table while discreetly observing the stranger. None of them knew who this man was, but they all sensed that trouble had just walked in. With effortless poise, the newcomer approached the bar, quietly requesting a whiskey in a voice made low and rough by years spent under an unrelenting sun. Anna poured the stranger his drink in silence, her practiced hands steady even under the weight of uncertainty. She risked a closer look as she slid the glass across the aged bar. His features were angular, his skin bronzed by many days in harsh deserts, and a faint scar traced the line of his jaw. He sipped slowly, acknowledging her with a slight nod. The tavern's interior was dim, its walls stained with decades of whiskey spills and leftover bullet holes from the occasional brawl. A mirror behind the bar provided a distorted reflection of the patrons, including two ranchers in sweat-stained hats and a wiry gambler rolling dice repeatedly at a side table, as if stuck in a never-ending loop of idle distraction. Outside, the clop of hooves approached. A door slammed against its frame as Diego, the Cobra, Valdez strutted in, flanked by three members of El Zorro Delgado's gang. Valdez was tall, lanky, and unkempt, sporting a permanently sneering mouth and eyes that teemed with malice. His left hand hovered near his revolver, visible even through the open drape of his vest. The tension in the saloon tightened instantly. Two of Valdez's men sidled off to either side, effectively taking strategic positions near the gambler's corner table and the out-of-tune piano. The third lingered by the entrance, leaning casually against the wall but staying alert. Anna felt her throat go dry. She had seen Valdez here before, extorting free drinks and harassing customers ever since El Zorro's crew seized control of Saddle Creek. He had a reputation for cruelty, though he was less cunning than his boss. If El Zorro Delgado was the sophisticated spider at the center of a vast and deadly web, then Diego Valdez was the spider's venomous sidekick, brash, arrogant, and eager to strike. The gambler, noticing the threat in the air, stopped rolling his dice and slowly pocketed them. Eyes shifting warily, Anna surreptitiously slid her hand under the bar, palming the sawed-off shotgun she kept there for emergencies. She knew better than to brandish it openly. She'd only do that if she was certain to pull the trigger. Her gaze flicked to the stranger with the poncho, unsure if he recognized the peril he was in. The man took another sip of whiskey, calm as still water at dawn. "New face in town," Valdez drawled, his snake-like grin spreading wide. "Got yourself a dusty poncho and an attitude from what I hear." He half-drawled the last part, letting the insult hang. His men snickered, anticipating a show of intimidation. The stranger offered no reply. He set his whiskey down, turning only his head, just enough to look at Valdez from beneath the brim of his hat. Anna could almost feel the iron in his stare. "You deaf or just foolish?" Valdez prodded, stepping closer until he was practically spitting words in the stranger's face. No immediate answer came. Instead, the newcomer shifted, letting the poncho fall aside. A glint of polished gunmetal caught the lantern light. The men in the saloon tensed, uncertain. Outside, wind rattled a loose shutter. Then, quicker than anyone could blink, the stranger's revolver cleared leather in a blur. A single thunderous shot rang out. Diego Valdez's smug face twisted in disbelief. He staggered, clutching at the sudden crimson spreading across his shirt. His men reached for their weapons, but the stranger's second shot already barked, and then the third, each discharge echoing in the confined saloon like the final toll of a death knell. By the time the echo subsided, three outlaws were on the floor, unmoving, and the gambler had taken cover behind an upturned table. The moment after the gunfire was as silent as a tomb, save for the ragged breathing of the terrified patrons. Smoke curled lazily from the muzzle of the stranger's revolver, the acrid smell of spent powder mingling with the thick tension in the air. Anna Morales stood frozen behind the bar, her hands still gripping the hidden shotgun. She glanced at the sprawled bodies of the outlaws, her mind reeling at the speed with which a deadly standoff had turned into a one-sided slaughter. Valdez still twitched, but the other two men were clearly done for. The gambler peered over the overturned table, eyes wide. In the far corner, Dr. Howe cautiously rose from his seat, ready to tend to the injured, though he had little hope Valdez would survive a wound at such close range. At last, the stranger holstered his weapon with the same fluid grace he had drawn it. His expression gave nothing away. No remorse, no anger, no satisfaction. If anything, he appeared resigned, as though this was yet another chore in a long line of duties. He turned back to his whiskey, downing it in a single swallow. Anna found her voice, albeit strained. "You have any idea what you've just started?" Her words emerged hoarsely, filled with concern and a hint of awe. The stranger's gaze swept the saloon, the gambler's trembling hand, the ranchers doing their best to blend into the walls, Dr. Howe hovering over the outlaws. Finally, he returned his gaze to Anna. "Name's Mateo Rojas," he said quietly, his accent hinting at roots south of the border. "I'm here for Delgado." At the mention of El Zorro Delgado, a ripple of shock ran through the room. Anna noted that Rojas did not say El Zorro Delgado, only Delgado, dropping the showy moniker as though it didn't matter. It was common knowledge that Delgado had once been a captain in a paramilitary unit. In some rumors, he was a disgraced officer who turned on his own men and sold them out to criminal gangs. Now he had an ever-expanding band of mercenaries and deserters at his beck and call, terrorizing anyone who dared stand in his way. Anna set the shotgun aside, her stomach twisting. He'll come down on all of us for this. The last person who challenged Delgado. She hesitated, remembering the slaughter that had befallen a nearby ranch and the horror stories that circulated afterward. No one survived. Mateo exhaled softly. The difference is, I've seen what he does, and I've survived it before. He opened his poncho enough for her to catch sight of a battered old badge pinned to his belt, its insignia worn away but still recognizable as a federal police emblem from several years ago. He and I have unfinished business. He locked eyes with Anna, and I don't plan on dying until that business is done. Outside, a pair of townspeople peered through the swinging doors, eyes bulging at the sight of 3 dead outlaws on the floor. Anna could feel the dread building inside her chest. The rest of Delgado's men would be on their way soon enough, and the consequences for the saloon and the entire town would be dire. Yet as she looked at Mateo Rojas and recalled the inhuman swiftness of his draw, she wondered if perhaps for once, Saddle Creek had a fighting chance against tyranny. Either you're the bravest fool alive, Anna murmured, taking a ragged breath, or you just might be our salvation. Rojas gave a curt nod, as if her statement required no further comment. Dr. Howe, stooping over Valdez, gave Anna a meaningful look. Valdez was fading fast, unable to speak, blood pooling around him. There would be no interrogation here, no gleaning of information about El Zorro Delgado's next moves. The sound of heavy boots on the boardwalk outside announced the arrival of Sheriff Ronald Carter. He pushed through the saloon doors, his eyes landing first on the dead men and then on the ragged figure by the bar. Carter's expression was a curious mix of fear, relief, and residual shame that never seemed to leave him. His once proud stance had withered under the weight of sorrow and guilt. But in the dim light of the saloon, a flicker of the old lawman glinted in his gaze. "What in the blazes happened here?" Carter demanded, though his tone lacked the authority it once carried. Anna explained, her voice hushed, how 3 of Delgado's men had arrived, and how this newcomer, Mateo Rojas, had dispatched them in a flash. Carter looked upon the fallen outlaws with grim acknowledgement. They all knew Delgado would not let such a bold affront go unpunished. Carter scratched at the stubbles on his cheek, his weariness momentarily replaced by curiosity. "Your name's Rojas, right? Federal once?" Anna relayed the detail about the battered badge. At length, Rojas dipped his head in the affirmation. "I was federal police," Viti said, "until Delgado betrayed us all." He spoke not out of pride but out of duty, as though reciting facts from a grim personal ledger. "When he turned corrupt, he sold out half my unit. I lived. Others didn't." That confession, spoken in a low, steady voice, sent a chill through the saloon. Hal rose from Valdez's lifeless body, shaking his head in quiet resignation. He motioned for 2 bystanders to haul the corpses outside. Carter, swallowing thickly, signaled them to use the undertaker's shed behind the sheriff's office. Already the sheriff seemed uncertain about how to handle the reprisal that was certain to follow. Anna placed a trembling hand on Carter's shoulder. "Sheriff, Delgado's men will return in force. This is the biggest challenge to his rule in months." She tried and failed to hide the tremor in her voice. "We all know what that means." Carter's troubled gaze flickered toward Rojas. "How fast is Delgado likely to respond?" he asked, stepping around a broken table to reach him. "Knowing him, he'll muster a large squad before he rides in, right?" Rojas responded with a single nod. His eyes narrowed. "In my experience, he'll want to crush the threat publicly. He'll show up in front of everyone and make an example to scare any other town with the nerve to resist." A hush fell again, punctuated by the distant neighing of horses outside and the clink of glasses as Anna tried to steady her hands. A sense of inevitability clung to the smoky air. Carter realized with a sinking feeling that he could no longer hide behind self-pity and whiskey. "We need to gather able-bodied townspeople," he said, trying to anchor himself in the responsibility he had abandoned. "Ranchers, miners, tradesmen, anyone who can hold a gun." "But that might not be enough, Carter," Anna cut in, voice taut. "We're short on ammo, and fear runs thicker than water in these parts. Delgado's men are many, and they've all been hardened by brutality. Rojas spoke up, calm and sure. The key isn't numbers, it's surprise, and the willingness to do what they can't imagine. His jaw tightened, and he fixed Carter with a meaningful stare. I'll help plan, but I'll need your cooperation, and the cooperation of every soul in this town. The sheriff stiffened, torn between intimidation and a faint glimmer of revived spirit. Then let's talk, he said finally, gesturing to a table away from the fresh bloodstains on the floor. Rojas nodded, his face unreadable, but Anna thought she perceived a faint sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, this deadly stranger and the embattled sheriff could give Saddle Creek a fighting chance. Night draped Saddle Creek in a cloak of uneasy darkness, broken only by the glow of lanterns in Anna's saloon and a few scattered lights in houses where families huddled in anxious discussion. The saloon's main room had been rearranged for a clandestine war council. Sheriff Carter sat at a central table, a spread of hastily scribbled notes and maps before him, while Anna, Dr. Howe, Carolina Reyes, and a handful of townspeople stood around with apprehension etched into their faces. Mateo Rojas hovered near the door, his poncho blending into the shadows, arms crossed as he surveyed their meager resources. Anna gently unrolled a map of the local terrain, borrowed from the telegraph office next door. Crumpled but serviceable, it showed the winding roads and rocky passes that surrounded Saddle Creek. We know Delgado has a base in the hills to the east, she said, her voice hushed but resolute. His men ride out to shake down ranchers and travelers, then return to those hills like rattlesnakes retreating to a den. He's got at least 30 men, maybe more. Everyone's eyes flicked toward Rojas, silently asking for confirmation. He leaned over the table, pointing to a ridgeline. They'll likely come from here first, close to the old mines. That's the quickest route if he wants to take us by storm. Carolina Reyes, a poised young woman with sharp eyes, spoke next. She worked part-time in the telegraph office, back when it had functioned, and had often witnessed the frantic dispatches that passed through. We might be dealing with more than 30, she cautioned. The last message I managed to read before the lines were cut mentioned Delgado recruiting new guns to expand his territory. They're calling it the future empire of El Zorro Delgado. Sheriff Carter rubbed his temples in frustration. We're low on ammunition. I've got a handful of men who can shoot straight, but half the townsfolk have never fired a gun in their lives. We can't face him in an open firefight. Dr. Howe chimed in, we'll need a field hospital. My clinic is too small to handle mass casualties. Maybe we can use the church basement as a makeshift ward. Rojas, who had been silent up to this point, stepped forward. A direct confrontation is suicide, he confirmed, scanning the worried faces around the table. But Delgado's arrogance can be turned against him. We can set traps, use choke points, force his men into positions where their numbers don't matter. He paused, looking over the map's spiderweb of streets. Every alley can become a kill zone if we position properly. Every rooftop can serve as an ambush. The mines, if we can access them, might prove crucial. Curiosity lit up in Anna's eyes. The old silver mines entrance collapsed years ago, but there are said to be hidden tunnels beneath some buildings. Rojas nodded as though this was exactly the kind of advantage he hoped for. They can be used to stage surprise attacks or even for evacuation. Worst case scenario, we could turn the tunnels into a weapon if we have the means to do so. When you're talking about explosives, Carter said grimly, recalling the crates of leftover dynamite that once served to blow open new veins in the hills. They had been gathering dust in a locked storage shed near the mine's shuttered entrance. Blowing half the town might kill us all. Rojas met his stare unflinchingly. Better that than letting Delgado slaughter everyone. But I've seen these tactics work. Trust me, we can minimize the destruction if we plan carefully. A fearful but determined silence settled over the group. Each person weighed the risk of waging all-out war in their own streets against the certainty of brutal subjugation if they did nothing. The clock ticked in the background, measuring out the few remaining hours before Delgado made his move. By dawn, Saddle Creek was a town under silent mobilization. Sheriff Carter had visited every small homestead on the outskirts during the night, rousing ranchers and even itinerant laborers from their beds to join the cause. Those capable of shooting or fighting were asked to gather in the dusty main street by first light. Ana Morales oversaw the distribution of limited ammunition from behind her bar, counting out bullets with trembling hands. Carolina Reyes turns the shuttered telegraph office into a makeshift command post, rummaging through old papers that might detail the mineshaft's layout. Dr. Howe, along with two volunteer nurses, prepared the church basement for triage, lining up cots scavenged from the boarding house. Mateo Rojas, meanwhile, inspected the leftover crates of dynamite. They were older than he would have liked. Years spent in storage raised the risk of instability, but he handled them with a methodical caution that revealed his training. As the pinkish light of dawn illuminated the dusty crates, Rojas thought back to an earlier time in his life, when he and his brother had been fresh recruits, full of conviction that they could cleanse the borderlands of corruption. His brother's face flashed in his mind, fueling a vow that he had carried ever since Delgado had put a bullet in him. Each stick of dynamite was another step toward repaying that blood debt. Outside, men and women converged with varied expressions of resolve and apprehension. Carter addressed them, struggling to muster the commanding presence he once possessed. "You all know what we face. El Zorro Delgado has ravaged towns before and left them in flames. If we don't fight now, there will be nothing left to defend." He paused, scanning the crowd, gray-haired ranchers clutching hunting rifles, teenage farmhands gripping shotguns too big for their frames, a handful of traveling merchants who had the misfortune to be stuck here when Delgado's blockade began. "We have a plan," Carter continued, "but it hinges on everyone playing their part. We'll create choke points and ambush spots. Those less experienced with firearms will help set traps or provide support in Dr. Howe's makeshift hospital. We can win if we act together." Rojas took the stage next, in a manner of speaking. He stood on an overturned crate, speaking quietly but with lethal certainty. "Delgado thrives on fear. I've seen men frozen solid when they hear his name. But I've also seen him bleed, and I've seen him run. Remember that." He pointed down the main street. "We'll funnel them from that end. Up on the rooftops, we'll have the best shots. Use the rise of the buildings to your advantage. Every window is a vantage point. Every alley can be booby-trapped." He explained how signals would be sent, mirrors flash from building to building, or torches lit at key moments, to let the defenders know when to fall back or when to spring new traps. "Your job," he added, fixing the volunteers with a stern gaze, "is to stay alive and keep Delgado's men guessing." The morning wore on, a furious symphony of hammering nails, moving crates, and whispered strategy. Barricades of wooden carts and furniture sprouted across the main street. Buckets of tar were placed at intervals, ready to be lit and rolled out to confuse attacking riders. Enough hay bales to feed a moderate ranch for a month were stacked in labyrinthine formations, rigged to catch fire at a moment's notice. Carolina diligently marked every hidden path on her map, cross-referencing the mineshaft diagrams. Lines were drawn in charcoal, showing places where Rojas recommended placing dynamite to block or collapse potential infiltration routes. As the preparations continued, an unspoken dread weighed on everyone. Could 100 terrified townsfolk, armed with outdated guns and precarious explosives, truly stand against the might of El Zorro Delgado's well-equipped forces? Yet as midday approached, a collective grit began to replace their fear. They had a plan, an unconventional, desperate plan, but one guided by the expertise of a man who had once served among Delgado's ranks. And for the first time in months, the battered spirit of Saddle Creek felt a hint of defiance. Maybe, just maybe, they stood a chance. The tension that had built through the morning finally snapped like an overstretched wire when a lookout perched atop the old water tower signaled the approach of riders on the eastern horizon. Clouds of dust trailed behind them, indicating a sizable force advancing at a swift pace. Sheriff Carter swallowed hard as he relayed the warning down the line of barricades. Dr. Howe cleared his makeshift triage area and glanced at Carolina Reyes, who gave a nervous nod. Everyone knew this was only the opening gambit. Delgado rarely put all his strength into a first assault. Nevertheless, they had no choice but to meet it head-on. Mateo Rojas positioned himself near the intersection, flanked by the general store and a boarded-up hotel. He could see Ana Morales crouched behind crates to his left, rifle in hand, while Carter and two volunteer deputies waited behind a partially upturned wagon to his right. When Delgado's men finally galloped into range, Rojas spotted about a dozen of them, enough to test the town's defenses but not Delgado's full might. Their leader for this sortie was a hulking brute named Lorenzo Ortiz, notorious for cruelty with a bullwhip. Ortiz slowed his horse just shy of the barricades, scanning the deserted main street with suspicion. If he was expecting the place to be empty, the newly constructed fortifications surely gave him pause. Suddenly, a shot rang out from one of the rooftops. Ortiz's lieutenant toppled from his saddle, his cry lost in the clamor of startled horses. Chaos ensued. The outlaws reflexively fired at windows and rooftops, trying to flush out hidden marksmen. Rojas motioned to Carter, who raised his revolver and fired in measured response. The ensuing firefight crackled along the street, bullets pinging off barrels and window frames. Ortiz bellowed a command for his men to dismount and press forward on foot, evidently hoping to push through the barricades in a concentrated rush. That was precisely when Rojas triggered the first trap. He tossed a small homemade firebomb, a ball filled with lamp oil stuffed with rags, into the path of the advancing gunmen. It burst into flame with a roar, forcing the outlaws to scatter. From behind wagons and crates, the town defenders opened fire with renewed vigor. Anna's rifle barked twice, cutting down 2 more bandits. A handful of ranchers armed with shotguns drove the attackers back further. Luis and Pedro Vargas, brothers who once toiled in the silver mines, rained rocks and debris from an upper window onto the outlaws, pinning them down. Surprised and outmaneuvered, Ortiz and his men retreated behind the half-ruined blacksmith shop. They clearly hadn't expected such organized resistance from Saddle Creek, which until now had cowered beneath Delgado's reign. But they were far from beaten. Ortiz fired 3 shots in the air, a harsh staccato signal. Moments later, additional riders appeared, this time emerging from the west. A second wave, smaller but more cunning, flanked the town's defenses and aimed to encircle them. Rojas cursed under his breath. This was a classic Delgado maneuver, probe from one side, then strike from another while defenders were engaged. Carter recognized the tactic too and yelled for men on the west barricade to stand ready. The staccato bark of rifles crackled in that direction, signifying that the new threat had engaged. Though the defenders fought valiantly, the sheer volume of gunfire began to wear them down. Dust and smoke filled the air, turning the once quiet main street into a choking battlefield. Yet amidst it all, Rojas directed movement with efficient gestures, his voice cutting through the clamor. He guided a small squad to plug a gap near the church, ensuring no outlaws slipped through the perimeter. The opening skirmish was fierce, but it was only the start. The real question that loomed, unspoken in every gunshot and cry, was when El Zorro Delgado himself would appear, and how many soldiers he would bring when he did. As dusk descended, the air hung hot and still, saturated with the pungent mix of gunpowder, sweat, and smoldering debris. Despite the defenders' best efforts, the bandits continued pressing the attack in waves, each thrust testing a different sector of the barricades. Several hours of this relentless onslaught had left the townsfolk exhausted. Musket barrels glowed with residual heat, and ears rang from the constant concussive blasts. Sheriffs Carter and Dr. N. Howe coordinated what rest they could for the volunteers, rotating shooters off the line to snatch precious minutes of sleep or a quick meal. Even Anna, who had once vowed she would never lift a firearm again after her husband's death, found her hands shaking on the stock of a rifle as she tried to steady her breath between every shot. Mateo Rojas remained in near constant motion, orchestrating ambush points and sending silent signals with flashes of light or coded whistles. He was here, then gone, appearing on a rooftop just in time to lay down covering fire, then vanishing into an alley to supervise the placement of more improvised explosives. The defenders had skillfully used the labyrinthine streets and hidden mine tunnels to stage sudden flanking maneuvers. More than once, a bandit patrol found itself trapped from both sides, with no way out but back into a hail of lead. Still, the tension felt as if it were only rising. Everyone suspected that these engagements, brutal as they were, constituted only Delgado's warm-up act. He was testing the town's resources and searching for weaknesses. Around midnight, a lull settled over the battlefield, filled with ominous quiet broken only by the moans of the wounded. In the makeshift hospital beneath the church, Dr. Howe labored tirelessly. A row of wounded defenders lined the walls, a testament to the intensity of the fighting. Blood stained the blankets, and the air held the metallic tang of raw injury. Anna and Carolina bandaged arms and legs with trembling urgency, taking brief moments to reassure the injured that the battle was not lost. Some volunteers who had never seen so much blood before stood pale-faced, trying to suppress the nausea that churned in their stomachs. But the respite did not last long. The shrill whinny of a horse and the clatter of hooves echoed down the eastern road. Several men posted as lookouts rushed to spread the word. A large contingent of riders, more than they had seen all day, was emerging from the darkness. And at the forefront was El Zorro Delgado himself. He rode a powerful gray stallion, bedecked with silver conchos that gleamed even in the faint moonlight. Flanked by his most trusted lieutenants, he cut a striking figure, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and a polished belt studded with brass. His face was obscured by the wide brim of a decorated sombrero, but everyone knew who it was. Delgado's name alone was enough to send a tremor of fear through the battered defenders. He halted his contingent just beyond the main barricade. By torchlight, he surveyed the battered street with a cool, calculating gaze. Despite the piles of bandit bodies scattered about, grim evidence of the defenders' success, Delgado appeared more curious than alarmed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried easily across the debris-littered avenue, tinged with contemptuous amusement. "I give you credit, Sheriff. It's been some time since I've seen a town put up such a fight. It's almost admirable. But make no mistake, I have more men, more weapons, and all the time in the world. Surrender now, and I might be merciful." Across the barricade, volunteers glanced anxiously at each other. Some gulped back panic. Others hissed curses, determined not to yield. But Delgado's gaze, sharper than any knife, soon settled on a solitary figure stepping into view. Mateo Rojas, Poncho stirring in the night breeze. Delgado's lips parted in a slow, predatory grin. "So, the dog I left for dead has come back to bite," he observed, his voice dripping with sardonic amusement. "You have a habit of meddling in my affairs, Rojas. This time I will finish what I started." Mateo Rojas stared back at El Zorro Delgado, memories of betrayal turning his blood to ice. Through the thin moonlight, he could see the battered insignia on Delgado's belt, a twisted mockery of the badge they had once both sworn to uphold. For years, he'd carried his vengeance in silence, waiting for the moment to confront this man who had shattered so many lives. "Finish it if you can," Rojas called back, revolver in hand, voice steady despite his roiling anger. "The people here won't bow to you." Delgado's mocking laugh pierced the heavy night air. With a curt gesture, he ordered his men forward in a sudden unified charge. Horses thundered down the street, hooves striking sparks off the cobblestones. The defenders braced themselves behind barricades, rifles and shotguns aimed at the oncoming horde. Gunfire erupted in a near-constant roar that lit the darkness in bursts of orange muzzle flare. Delgado's men launched torches at rooftops, hoping to start fires that would flush out snipers. Several structures caught flame, sending thick smoke billowing over the street. Rojas timed the trigger of his trap perfectly. A cloth-wrapped charge of dynamite, small enough to avoid leveling half the town, detonated beneath the front line of Delgado's cavalry. Horses reared and screamed, scattering riders in disarray. The defenders seized the opportunity to gun down the outlaws that were thrown from their mounts, forcing Delgado to halt and regroup behind the glow of newly lit torches. For a moment, it seemed the defenders might repel yet another wave. But Delgado's cunning soon manifested. While the frontal assault kept the defenders pinned, a stealthy band of his most skilled gunmen slipped through an alley near the church. Within minutes, gunfire erupted behind the defenders' lines as the infiltrators shot at unprotected flanks. Sheriff Carter rallied what few men he could to block this advance, but the infiltration caused the defense to waver. Volunteers split their attention, some rushing to protect the medical station, others struggling to hold the barricades from the main force. Flames roared higher, illuminating the street in a hellish tableau. Smoke choked the air. The wounded cried out for help, while the staccato bark of gunfire echoed between buildings. Rojas darted through swirling embers, searching desperately for Delgado. The final confrontation, he knew, could tip morale irreversibly. His plan had always been to drive Delgado's men into the older part of town, where the half-collapsed tunnels made the ground unstable. A single carefully placed explosive might bring down entire sections of roadway, burying Delgado's men beneath splintered timbers. But to lure Delgado closer, Rojas needed a direct confrontation. At last, he found Delgado near the ruins of the blacksmith's shop, orchestrating the chaos like a general surveying a battlefield. With a snarl, Rojas fired a shot that struck Delgado's lieutenant beside him, sending the man slumping to the ground. Delgado whirled, returning fire with lethal precision. The bullet grazed Rojas's shoulder, spinning him back. Pain surged through him, but his grip on his revolver held. Gritting his teeth, he advanced. Around them, bandits and townsfolk engaged in grim, close-quarters combat, pistols flashing in the flickering orange glow of distant flames. Clutching his wounded shoulder, Rojas moved toward a set of support beams that marked the old mineshaft entrance under the northern edge of town. If Delgado pursued him there, all it would take was a lit fuse on a well-placed charge to seal their fate. The ground beneath them rumbled slightly, a sign that other explosions had already triggered partial collapses. He had one last desperate gambit, to bury El Zorro Delgado in his dreams of domination in the depths of the earth itself. Exhaustion gnawed at every muscle in Mateo Rojas's body as he retreated into the crumbling alleyway that led to the old mineshaft under the blacksmith's remains. His shoulder throbbed from the graze, blood seeping through the torn fabric of his poncho. In his right hand, he clutched the fateful dynamite stick wrapped in a short fuse. The ground here was treacherous. Splintered planks and rotting supports from the old tunnels lurked just below the surface. He could hear the sounds of fighting echo behind him, the thunder of hooves, shouts, sporadic gunshots, and the crackle of flames devouring buildings. But the noise began to recede as he ventured deeper, step by cautious step. Then he heard it, the steady tread of boots. El Zorro Delgado was following. "You can't hide, Rojas," came Delgado's voice, thick with rage and dark amusement. "I taught you better than that." A gunshot rang out, ricocheting off the stone wall dangerously close to Rojas's head. Rojas dove behind a collapsed timber, heart hammering in his ears. He struggled to keep calm, reminding himself that the entire plan hinged on drawing Delgado into this unstable ground. Soon enough, Delgado stepped around a break in the alley, the flickering firelight from outside casting deep shadows on his face. His polished belt buckle gleamed, and the brim of his sombrero cast a swath of darkness over his eyes. Gun extended, Delgado looked every inch the warlord who had brought so many towns to their knees. "You've been a thorn in my side long enough," he spat. "Time to face me in the open." Rojas exhaled softly, letting the pain in his shoulder sharpen his resolve. He rose slowly, gun aimed at Delgado. Both men fired almost simultaneously. Delgado's bullet smashed into a wooden beam inches from Rojas's torso, while Rojas's shot tore through Delgado's thigh. Delgado staggered, cursing as he tried to brace himself against the shaking ground. Something groaned ominously in the darkness beneath them, an old support beam on the verge of collapse. "That was for my brother," Rojas snarled through clenched teeth. He had to time this perfectly. With his free hand, he struck a match against a stone, lighting the short fuse on the dynamite. Delgado's eyes widened in furious realization. He lunged forward, ignoring the pain in his leg, but Rojas hurled the stick toward the splintered timbers behind Delgado. The gunman twisted in mid-lunge, torn between diving for cover and trying to snuff out the fuse. The next second brought a searing flash of light and a thunderous roar. A massive explosion tore through the alley, ripping apart rotted beams and sending stones tumbling into the open tunnels beneath. The earth gave way under Delgado's feet. With a howl of rage, the self-proclaimed kingpin plummeted into the collapsing depths, vanishing amidst the infernal collapse of timber and rock. Dust and debris filled the air, choking Rojas as he stumbled backward. Dazed by the sheer force of the blast, for a few seconds he thought he would also be swallowed by the collapsing ground. But the partial roof of the blacksmith's shop held fast, and Rojas managed to brace himself on a leaning pillar. When the dust finally cleared, an eerie silence reigned. The passage where Delgado had stood was now an impassable sinkhole of rubble. El Zorro Delgado, the cunning ex-officer who had built an empire on fear and blood, was entombed beneath the very town he aimed to conquer. At that moment, a ragged cheer rose from the streets outside. The sound of gunfire had dwindled. Sheriff Carter and a band of volunteers rushed forward, noticing the ground had collapsed in a swirl of dust. They found Rojas slumped against the remains of a wall, breath ragged but alive. Carter crouched, ignoring his own wounds, and asked what had happened. Rojas gestured weakly at the mass of debris. "He's gone," he rasped, and let his head fall back against the timber. Ana Morales, rifle still in hand, came running with Dr. Howe close behind. Relief and awe mingled on her face as she surveyed the destruction that had consumed Delgado. By dawn, the fires that had engulfed parts of Saddle Creek were smoldering embers, and most of Delgado's remaining men had fled or surrendered once they realized their leader was dead. The survivors of the town congregated in the scorched streets, hugging one another, wiping tears from soot-streaked faces. The cost had been high. Buildings lay in ruins, and many good people were wounded or worse. But Delgado's tyranny had been buried forever, sealing a promise of a new beginning for Saddle Creek. Over the following weeks, the town would rebuild from the ashes, forging a renewed spirit out of shared trauma. And as for Mateo Rojas, once he had healed enough to ride, he quietly departed one morning, leaving a simple note behind for Sheriff Carter and Ana Morales. Justice is served, but my path continues. His departure marked the end of a storm, yet the memory of the man in the poncho, the deadliest shot in the frontier, would resonate in Saddle Creek's stories for generations to come. From the opening standoff to the final dust-filled confrontation, this saga of redemption and resistance proves that courage can shine brightest when all hope seems lost. We've witnessed a broken town unite behind a determined few, watched old grudges transform into moments of reckoning, and marveled as sacrifice sparked a rebirth of pride and justice. Ultimately, every sacrifice, whether made by seasoned gunslingers or humble townsfolk, became a stepping stone toward a future free from tyranny. And isn't that the heart of every great story? People banding together to overcome impossible odds. We hope you found a spark of inspiration or at least a thrilling escape from the everyday. Please share your thoughts and theories in the comments. Let's keep the conversation going. If you haven't already, subscribe and stay tuned for more tales filled with grit, bravery, and hard-won triumph. After all, the frontier is vast and there are many more stories waiting to be told.